All right. So this week, oops, any apologies? Let me just go back to the module section here on Canvas. This week, we're going to do it a little bit differently. We're going to distribute the content just a little bit differently, but ultimately, we're going to really focus on materials and the rendering process inside of Maya. Now, we touched a little bit about it last week, just a teeny tiny bit. Today, we're going to take another massive step forward into the art of rendering and working with materials and textures and lights and rendering inside of Maya. It's kind of a beast. I'm going to stop it before it even does it again, that audio glitch we ran into last time. Do we have any show-stopping problems that we ran into over the last 7 days, or the last week or so of working with our candlestick? Yes? Working with the what? Yeah, so my biggest suggestion to you, and this is almost a requirement of the class, okay, and here's a spare one if anyone wants to borrow it, is a mouse. Is a mouse. Maya almost requires a 3-button mouse. Working on a trackpad is okay. I mean, it kind of works, but as many of you guys have experienced already, we need that middle mouse button. It's not just kind of a vanity utility. We require a click or click and drag from that middle mouse button function. So get a mouse. Get a good one, okay? Get one that works for you. Yeah, we're going to need it. A 3-button mouse. You don't need one of those fancy like gaming mice that's got like a zillion buttons on it with like custom remapping and like the 8 million degrees of sensitivity. You don't need that for what we're doing. A standard $15 Logitech mouse is going to do us pretty well, okay? And find one that fits your hands too. Like seriously, it's kind of an important thing. Believe it or not, this is the fastest way to end your career is to work with a mouse and a keyboard that doesn't ergonomically match your body. These things here, your wrists, are now your most valuable asset going forward in the world of computer graphics. Because the moment you have that carpal tunnel surgery, is the moment you can't sit in front of a computer for like 8 hours a day. And in our world, that's just kind of what we do. Okay, so take care of your wrists, get a good mouse, and you're going to need one. You really are. You're going to need one for what we're doing. Now, a couple of you guys ran into some issues with saving your image, and it was getting a little bit darker upon saving. And I wanted to show you a little addition to our workflow that will help kind of resolve that problem pretty quickly. I'm just going to jump into Maya here real fast. And just because I have it on my machine, I'm going to import in a model file that we've been using for on week 1. It was that teapot. Give me a second here. There we go. That way we have something fun to look at as we go through this example. Okay, so last week we talked about creating very, very simple materials and some very simple lighting setups to start illuminating our scene. Before we go too much further, I'm also going to add a plane. There it is, sitting down there at the bottom, so that I have something for my teapot to be sitting on. And let's also turn off the visibility of our grid. That grid is nice, but when you have large objects in a big scene, sometimes it just gets in the way. And let's also change our perspective here, or our viewport's information to start showcasing all of our film and resolution gate stuff, so we know exactly what the camera is going to take a picture of. Kind of helps you compose and make good shots. All right, that's pretty good. Okay, and let's also, I'm going to go into the rendering shelf and just add a very, very simple, let's do a directional light. And last week, the directional light, as we kind of talked about, does what? What's the function of a directional light? What type of illumination does it create, a directional light? Very strong, like the sun. It's a wall of light, an infinite wall of light that's coming from a specific rotation value inside of our scene. And in every sense, it kind of simulates the sun. They're really fantastic for external light sources. All right, so let's see what that looks like when we hit the render button. All right, so there it is. Ta-da! Fantastic. Now, what's missing from this little scene here? Shadows. How do we turn the shadows on? Yes, attributes. And what's the first thing that we got to do before we can open up our attribute editor? Select it. You got it. And I always open up the outliner. You're going to find just with me that I just have the outliner open all the time. It's a really fast, easy way to select the different objects inside of our scene and get to the specific attribute editor information that's going to give us the results that we're after. So I've opened up our attribute editor. And I apologize. This is one of the horrible things about teaching on a projector whose resolution is very small, is that I run out of real estate in my screen very, very quickly. Does anyone remember where inside of our light attributes we're going to enable shadows? Yeah, we got to go down a little bit, right? Down a pretty significant amount. There it is, shadows. And then we're looking for depth map shadows. And I'll leave it at their defaults just to kind of make sure that it renders pretty quickly. We'll get all up in there. I'll make I'm being a 3D modeler now. There we go. Let's render it now and see what we get. And there it is. Now we're starting to get some basic, simple little shadows. Not real great. The quality of those depth map shadows are pretty low, and you can see a lot of jagged edges that are being produced from the render engine itself. Now, this is where we kind of ended last week, right? And some of you guys were running into some pretty big problems when you were saving your image, okay? And this is often the result that happened. You would file, and then you'd save image, right? And I'll just put up the desktop here real fast, and I'll call this teapot test. There we go. If I close out Maya and go find the file that I just created, it's a JPEG. Yeah, okay, so we have a little bit of an issue here. Now we're going to do some comparing and contrasting here. I want you to look at this image because this was the JPEG that was saved from Maya, right? Let's go back over into the render window in Maya. Bloop. What can you tell me? Which ones so they're definitely different, right? They're definitely different. The one in the background here is the render from Maya, and the one in the foreground is the image that we saved from Maya, right? And this one, is it lighter or darker? Much darker, okay? Now, oftentimes, so the question is, how do I get this? How do I save this image right here? And it has everything to do with the gamma curve that's being applied to the image upon saving it, okay? Right now, we're using a color space, of sRGB, okay? Which is going to change the color curve, if you will, of the pixels that are being saved from Maya. Now, sRGB is okay for a lot of applications, but for us, when we're saving into a JPEG has a very small color space that it works within. So we have to change our color space to match the low dynamic range of that JPEG, and here's the solution. 2.2 gamma, okay? Now, if you zoom out here for a second, let's just go back and forth. So here's what 2.2 looks like. Here's what sRGB looks like. What do you see? Not a single thing, right? Not a single thing. Now, and this is where usually the train derails and people start going, what? and all I have to say is, welcome to Maya. There's going to be a lot of moments like that where we kind of go, okay, all right, this is cool. Let's just work with this here, all right? This gamma curve isn't going to be applied to our render until we hit the save button, okay? Let's save it again. However, this time, and this is the pitfall that everyone falls into, and I fall into it too, because I'm so used to having it on that in an open lab environment where the default settings are enabled, I forget that I got to change it. Let's save it again. I'll put teapot test to 2_2 gamma just so we can see the difference. Okay. Let's save it one more time. And once again, compare and contrast. What? Still dark, right? This is the moment where you go, WTF, Pat? You said a minute ago that the gamma curve is applied when you save the image. What's going on here? It didn't change a single thing. And this is the thing that everyone misses, including myself, because I always forget. It's always on my side, because it's one of those things you turn on once and you kind of forget about it. Well, We got our 2.2 gamma curve applied over here. We'll save our image, and this is the part that just absolutely bakes my cookies, okay? If we hit save raw image, that gamma curve is not going to be applied to the export. We have to save color managed image, and things are going to come out exactly the way you think it's going to come out, okay? Now that gamma curve is going to be applied again, and we'll just put this save, or teapot test 2.2 gamma corrected. Why not? We'll save it. We'll jump back out, and huzzah, now we're there, okay? So it's that one radio button on the far right-hand corner of the Save dialog box from Maya that's going to sync your ship almost every single time. And let me just draw a focus to it one more time. It's this thing right there, okay? Save colored manage image. Then what you see here is what's going to be saved and exported from Maya. Okay, that's going to solve a lot of the problems that you guys were running into over the last couple days with your renders turning out incredibly dark, okay? So it's a two-step thing. We change the gamma curve here, and then when we save it, we just got to make sure that we save that gamma curve. It almost imprints it, if you will, into their export from Maya, okay? Does that make sense to everyone? Rock and roll. Hopefully this will resolve some of the issues that you guys have been running into over the past couple of days. All right. Okay. So I wanted to spend some time today just very quickly reviewing some of the ideas that we put forth last Thursday when it comes to working with materials. Because that hypergraph, man, or excuse me, that hypershade is a weird, wacky work environment, right? Creating materials is relatively easy, but managing them, editing them, and then expanding them to get a more complex, robust kind of result really is where the challenge begins. If I wanted to change a portion of my teapot here, and I think if I remember correctly, this teapot's constructed with 3 individual pieces, okay? So the spout is its own contiguous polygonal island to get the body, and then the handle is its own piece. If I wanted each one of these things to be different, a different color, excuse me, how would I do that? How would I do that? Let's figure it out real fast. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to come back to that later, but you're absolutely right. That's a great way of working, okay? But ultimately, if we kind of continue with that train of thought, what's the first thing that we have to do to change the color of our polygons? Select them. Yeah, you got them, right? Everything begins and ends with the selection, okay? We're telling the computer which parts of our scene that we want to adjust. So I'm going to go into my component mode here real fast, and let's select some. There we go. There's the spout. I apologize for the legibility of that selection. It's kind of hard to see. But now what's next? I heard someone say it, and you're absolutely right. Right click. Yep, right click and hold. You're going to get that crazy long contextual menu. The bottom here, of course, this is where we're used to going to change our selection state. Then way down here at the bottom, and I'll see if I can use my ninja skills here to zoom in whilst holding the right click button. Here we go. So we have assign new material, assign favorite material, and assign existing material. Now we want to change the color, so we need to create a new material. Let's go ahead and do it. It opens up the wonderful and ever-challenging hypershade environment. Now we have to pick which type of material. Now we didn't talk too much about this last week, but there's a number of different types of materials that are going to create the illusion of different surface characteristics. Let's just review what we went over last week, and then we'll jump into the differences between these materials. I'm going to choose good old Blinn or Fongy. Let's just do Blinn since it's at the top. There we go. Now that object's now been brought, or excuse me, a new material has been created, and I had it selected a minute ago. And it was the properties were over here inside of our attribute editor. And if you still have the attribute editor open, you can select that object, and way over here, there it is. These little arrows here will help you navigate to all the input nodes that are associated with that object, okay? And Blinn 1 was one of those objects way right there, Blinn 1. Let's give it a good name. I'll just call this material red, And then down below in its color attributes, right here, we'll make its color red. You can see that just the polygons that are associated with that material have been updated and changed. Let's do it one more time. Let's grab the body of our teapot. Oops, I'm on the wrong. There we go. Right-click, assign new material. This is why having a good naming convention for your materials is really important, because if you just leave them at the defaults, the computer's just automatically going to name all the materials, numerically. It's going to be blend 1, blend 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. And trust me, you will confuse yourself pretty quickly as to the role and the purpose of each one of these materials if you're not real direct with your naming conventions. Maya is a pretty difficult application. Okay, the deck is definitely stacked against us. Let's not make it harder than it needs to be. Name your stuff. It really does help. Okay, especially when it's like 3 a.m. Your homework assignment's due. In a couple hours. You're going to need to support and help your future self. All right, let's grab the back here real fast, and then once again, we'll just put this in a new material. Call this one blue. And there it is. That's kind of where we went through last week. Okay, that's as far as we got. Just simple colors, right? Simple colors. Now, if we take a look at the actual hypershade itself, we can start to see and understand how each one of these materials is created and how they're applied to the different parts of our model. Where can we go to open up our hypershade? Windows, yep. Windows. Rendering editors, right? And there it is, hypershade, okay? It's a beast, it's a big daddy, right? This hypershade is kind of massive. There's a lot of stuff going on in here. And now that we have a little bit more experience creating materials and working with materials, let's start to decode just a little bit here some of the really important details of the hypershade that make it an incredibly powerful tool for working with textures and materials, okay? So clearly at the top, we have a library of all the materials that are currently residing inside of our Maya project file. These are not necessarily materials that are applied to a specific object, okay? They're just kind of in the library, if you will. Here are the 3 that we just created, which is kind of neat. And if we select them, we can go and change a number of their surface characteristics way over here. Let's see if we can make this a little bit bigger. Believe it or not, this sphere here does a really great job of communicating a number of these surface attributes, because we want to change more than color. If you really take a step back and look at the role of a material in the larger context of computer graphics, the material is really responsible for determining how the light is going to interact with the surface that we're creating. It's all an illusion, really. It's all smoke and mirrors. I am the great and powerful Oz, but once we start opening up the hypershade, you're going to find out pretty quickly that I'm just a man in a hat, okay? Well, in the movie he had a hat. Now I don't have a hat now, but I do wear hats. I do like hats, by the way. So let's start pulling back the curtain a little bit more and looking at how each one of these properties over here and how the different types of materials are going to allow us to change the surface qualities and the surface illusions that we need to make for our objects. Perhaps I made this a little bit too big. There we go. All right. So let's just take a look at it. Now, the blend surface, the blend material is a pretty basic material. It doesn't come with a lot of bells and whistles. If you look at what our little shader ball up there looks like, what's the illusion that we get from the blend material type? Very smooth. Why do you say smooth? Absolutely. Okay, the light kind of evenly travels across the surface. Right? I like it. Smooth. There's kind of 2 things in here that we need to draw focus to pretty quickly to understand what's happening here. First is the color. What color is it? I have a nice shade of red. And then the second is the specular highlight. The specular highlight is really, really important for us to understand what type of material this is, the surface qualities, okay? Pop quiz. What in the world is the specular highlight? Anyone want to take a guess at it? The specular highlight in computer graphics using these simple materials is that white reflection in the upper left-hand corner. So that thing right there, that is the specular highlight. Take a guess. What is the specular highlight? What are we trying to simulate and recreate there? Yeah, the light source. The specular highlight is a reflection of the light source inside the scene. And how our object reflects that light source often defines the type of surface qualities that this material has adopted. Okay? So what could be like surface qualities? What in the hell am I talking about when I say surface qualities? Here's a good question to ask. Is the surface smooth or is it bumpy? Is it wood or is it metal? Is it like skin that absorbs a lot of light, or is it like aluminum that reflects light but kind of in a very kind of diffused way, right? These are the surface qualities that we need to kind of zero in on and define. Okay, the specular highlight is the first thing inside of our network that helps define our surface our surface qualities. Excuse me. All right. So how do we affect some of these surface qualities with the channels that are available to us down here in our hypershade? And FYI, and this is something that's really good to know, I like what Autodesk is trying to do with the role of the hypershade. In the past, the hypershade was just kind of a utility panel that listed all of the materials, but we really didn't get a good chance to edit the materials. Now they're giving us this wonderful development environment for us to understand how all these properties are affecting the materials. And we can go back and forth. That's why this thing right here, this is actually something that's really kind of cool. Because if we click this button, we go into what's called the Look Dev environment in the attribute editor. Okay? When we're looking in the Look Dev, just basically all the rock star channels, if you will, that are really influencing this material are being brought to the surface. Check it out. It's a much smaller list of channels for us to zero in on than what we saw when the attribute editor version of this panel was enabled a second ago. So this is everything, okay? Look Dev. Everything, Look Dev. And this is, I've grown to hate the attribute editor because of all of this mumbo jumbo down here at the bottom. The attribute editor is a challenging environment to work in because in every sense it's a general container for properties on like every single type of object that we can build inside of Maya. And sometimes there's things in here that we just don't need or is not applicable for the object that we're currently trying to edit. So I love that they're kind of culling that list in the Look Dev version of the hypershade to just the stuff that we want to work with. Okay? It's pretty great. All right. So now that we've kind of filtered and culled this gigantic list, let's look at some of these properties in here that really define how our surfaces are going to look. Okay? Now there's a couple in here that we need to look at. First and foremost, well, transparency is kind of obvious. It's how see-through this object is. Ambient color and incandescence, leave this alone. Okay? This is going to get you into trouble. But diffuse, this is interesting. Okay? As I increase and decrease this slider, look what's happening to our little shader ball up there. What's it doing? I heard it and I apologize for not hearing. Changing color? Yeah, absolutely. The diffuse value is really how much reflected light is coming off of this object. Okay? At the default values around 0.8 or 80%, that's a good starting point. Okay, the moment we start reducing this channel to something very, very small, we're not really reflecting a lot of surface color back into the scene. Here's an easy way of thinking about it. Think of it like how much surface color is on this object. We either have a lot of red or the absence of color is black, right? Or it's black. Okay, think of it like that. Generally speaking, for a lot of materials, you want to leave this kind of right around, 80%, right around in there. You're going to hear me say 8 percentages because that's how my mind has transitioned to understanding these values. Maya works inside of a 0 to 1.0 kind of value area for a lot of their channel values. And that can be easily translated into percentages, right? So a value of 0.5 would be how many percentages? 50%, right? So at 0.92, that's 92%. So in my mind, instead of trying to figure out numbers, it's like I want my diffuse value to be 80%, so I put 0.8 in there, okay? It's a way of thinking about it. Okay, let's put this back to 0.8. There we go. We're on our way. I'm going to close the common material properties area just to give me some more on-screen real estate. And now we can really start talking about that specular highlight. And the specular highlight is really kind of important for us, okay? Of course, naturally, we can change the specular color. We can make it anything we want. Here it is at blue, but this is an additive color environment. So it'll tint it, but you know, the surface color, the diffuse color of the object is going to have an influence on the illusion that we create here. It's a reflection of the light source. So if your light is red, maybe your specular highlight should be tinted ever so slightly red to help create the illusion, okay? This is all a trick. This is all an illusion, okay? This is all fake. We're recreating a real-world lighting setup here. So we've got to be very mindful of the colors of all the lights inside of our scene so we can kind of ripple edit our materials to include those small little details. All right, so the specular color is good, but the eccentricity is even more important. What are we doing here? Say again? Making it, I'm sorry, I can't understand you. Dull, is that what you said? Dull, making it look dull? Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately, we're changing the size of our specular highlight. Check it out. So it's the eccentricity. It's a fancy word for size. Here it is real small. Here it is real big. Okay? Small and big. This is the specular amount or the specular size. Now this, when we pair it with the roll-off, become real important features for us to zero in on. Okay? There we go. I want to make it very tight. I think we can even overdrive this value if I remember correctly. Let's put 1.5 in here. Yeah, there we go. We're just going to put our specular roll-off up to something quite high. Like 5, okay? Now, what is this doing? The specular roll-off. I've increased the values past its kind of stopping points of 0.1. My specular roll-off's at 5.360. Just visually, what have we created here? Perhaps let me zoom in so you guys can see what's going on. Okay, there it is at 5.3. Let's put it back to a value of 1. And I'll increase the size a little bit. I want you to look real carefully at the circle of the, that the specular highlight is kind of creating on the object itself. Look real carefully at that big white circle. Okay? How would you describe its edges at the moment? Very soft. Kind of smoothly attenuates into nothing, right? It's got a big white core, and then it smooths the kind of feathers into nothing, right? As we increase the specular roll-off, watch what happens to that border. I'll put this back to 5. What happens? Yeah, the edges are becoming more crisp. Let's put it at 15. And now that highlight, the edges of our highlight are becoming crisper and crisper and crisper. There's a relationship here between the eccentricity and the specular roll-off. This is the first thing that we need to start dialing in to help determine what type of material this is. Like I mentioned earlier, is it concrete? Is it metal? Is it skin? Is it wood? The specular highlight is the first object that's ultimately really responsible for that. Let me show you, or let's create an example in our minds real fast to kind of understand this a little bit more directly. Perhaps, okay, so we are standing in Fort Knox, right? You guys know Fort Knox in Kentucky, right? We've literally fought our way through the army surrounding Fort Knox, right? What's in Fort Knox? Does anyone know? It's one of the few places we have the United States Gold Reserve, right? Economics 101, right? Gold Reserve, what's the purpose of the Gold Reserve? The Federal Gold Reserve. Oh, no one knows. Oh, I wish I was given a quiz. I should be like an economics or a history teacher. This stuff's so fascinating, right? You know, if anyone has a dollar bill in their pocket, pull it out. Don't pull it out, actually. But that dollar bill is just a piece of paper, right? A coin is just a almost worthless hunk of metal. However, it has meaning and value because somewhere, and there's a couple places in the United States where they have them, that piece of paper is associated with a little bit of percentage of a hunk of gold, right? Yeah, we literally have a mountain of gold, okay, that represents, well, that's one of the factors that represents the value of our currency, right? In Fort Knox, I think there's like 3 or 4 different places around the United States where we have portions of our gigantic pile of gold, right? Think of it kind of like the Scrooge McDuck money tower, right? It's kind of like that. You guys know what I'm talking about? You guys never watched DuckTales? Really? Go watch DuckTales. Anyways, okay. So we fought through the army that surrounds Fort Knox, and there's literally an army around one of these gold reserves, right? I think it was a mobile infantry is around Fort Knox, right? And we've kicked down the door, boom, kicked down the door to Fort Knox, and we're standing in the gigantic gold vault, right? And you're sitting there and you see an endless cavern of gold, bullion cubes, the big gold blocks, right? You pick one up and you're careful because you don't want to drop one on your foot because that'd be bad. All right, that's a bad day happening right there. Because I've been told that they're like 40 pounds per gold block, right? You pick up a gold block, you look down, and what do you see? What's it look like? What's the surface of your gold bar look like? Shiny. How do you interpret shiny? Let's think like a computer for a second. Or perhaps let's think like artists that are using a computer to recreate these tools, right? How do you tell an alien from a far-off, distant planet what shiny looks like? Good question, right? Good question. We'll start breaking it down a little bit more, okay? Instead of just visually looking at the gold block that's in front of you, maybe in your imagination run your hand across the surface of said gold bullion cube. How does it feel? Pretty smooth, right? There's our first characteristic that we need to start zeroing in on. It's smooth, right? Now, something that's like metal, all the molecules and atoms are going to be very tightly packed in on something that's metal, right? So, what's the light going to do when it hits the surface? Reflect almost instantly, right? And that's one of the characteristics that makes it shiny, right? The light ray hits the surface, then boink, it reflects back out into the scene very, very quickly, right? The time that a light ray hangs out on the surface of our object is really related to the specular roll-off. For something like metal, we want a very tight, very small and very tight specular highlight, right? Because the light ray just goes, boop, and it's gone within a millisecond. It reflects back out into the scene. So for something like metal, increasing the specular roll-off and then decreasing its size will help us create the illusion of something like metal, like that. Step number 1. Very small, very tight specular highlight. So that light ray just reflects off the surface almost immediately. Okay? Now, the inverse of this, let's check it out for a second. Everyone kind of look down for a second. What material is our floor made out of? Concrete, right? Now, don't do this because I'm sure the floor is very dirty. But in your imaginations, run your hand along the floor in here. How's it feel? Bumpy, right? Kind of smoothish bumpy, but it's still kind of bumpy. There's a lot of pits and grooves, a lot of pores in the surface of the object. So what's going to happen to the light ray? It's going to absorb. You got it, right? And in my imagination, and let's draw this on the board here real fast. In my imagination, this is kind of what's happening. So the top one, this is our surface, right? The light ray comes down this way. Now for a hunk of metal, like our gold, there's no pits and grooves, right? It's not bumpy at all. It's pretty smooth. So the light ray just reflects almost immediately But for a surface that's like concrete, where it's like that, okay, if the light ray hits here, for example, what's going to happen? It's not going to reflect back out into the scene immediately. It might go blunk, blunk, and then reflect back out. The pits and the grooves kind of grab the light ray a little bit, and they're going to bounce around internally, perhaps, inside of all these little pits and grooves and keep the light on the surface longer, okay? So the result of that, the visual appearance that we need to create in this example here, is something a little bit different. And it all stems from our specular highlight. Check it out. So if we decrease the roll-off and increase the size, oops, I put it to 0. That was an accident. There we go. There we go. So a very small specular roll-off paired with a medium-sized eccentricity, now we're creating the illusion of something very different. Okay? It all begins and ends with that specular highlight. It really is the most important parameter inside of our entire shading network in the hypershade. Okay? It's pretty crazy cool. Questions on that? It's amazing how nerdy we have to get when it comes to lighting, right? So we're asking the computer, which is just taking a whole bunch of ones and zeros, to recreate something that's art, okay, or to create something that's art. These small channels, and I understand firsthand, oftentimes Maya forces us to be engineers instead of artists to produce something, pretty fantastic. So I get it. But with experience, it's kind of like the Matrix, right? When you first start seeing the Matrix, all you see is code, right? And then after a while, after you start looking at it for a long enough time, then you start seeing the pictures in the Matrix, right? I love the Matrix films, by the way. If there was ever a film franchise to continue, it's the Matrix, right? You guys Matrix fans? No? Just me? The first one was really good. The first one was actually quite perfect in every sense. 2 and 3, they lost a little bit of their mojo in 2 and 3. However, the story is interesting. If you ever want to see a cinematic comic book, go see the first Matrix film. That's probably as close as we've ever gotten. It's pretty fantastic. Mostly because the Wachowski brothers are big comic book nerds, right? Anywho. All right. Questions on what we've talked about so far? Everyone getting it for the most part? Okay, cool. Let's keep cruising because we're running out of time, and I apologize. Now, reflectivity, this isn't something that you're really going to see in our little shader ball, the reflectivity amount, mostly because there's nothing to reflect, okay? We're going to talk in the future about ray-traced reflections. We're going to keep it pretty simple. That's the next step is reflections. Recreating things that are recreating the reflections inside of our scene. But at the moment, this is just the amount of a reflection, okay? How reflective this object is. Okay. Then down here at the bottom, refractions. What's a refraction? So we have reflections and then refractions. Does anyone know the difference between the two? Reflection would be a light source or a light ray that is bounced externally off an object, right? So if you're hanging out in front of your car, the sun's hitting the roof of your car, that light ray is reflected back out into the environment instantly, right? A refraction is an internal reflection, right? What would be an object that, let's see, I'm looking around the room here. Let's see, I don't see anyone with a pair on at the moment, but there's a lot of folks that have long hair that are hiding their ears. Maybe yours. Okay, looking at her ears, by the way. See these often in people, right? What is an object that has internal reflections? You want to take a guess? Diamonds, right? Jewelry. Or a lens, yeah, on a piece of glass, right? Where the light rays penetrate through the surface because the surface is slightly transparent, and those light rays bounce around on the inside of the object, and then after a while, bloop, they reflect back out into the scene, right? That's a refraction. Water is something that's got a tremendous amount of refraction. We'll talk about this towards the end of this semester, but we actually can scientifically measure the refractions of an object through this refractive index, and it's a good starting point for us to figure out how to recreate these surfaces in the computer. But that's a conversation for another day, okay? All right. So let's go back to the top here for a second. Or let's do this. Let's change it back over into our attribute editor. And let's change the type of material that's available to us. Because the blend is pretty cool. The blend material is pretty rad. It gives us it's a good starting point. It's kind of one of the original materials that are available to us. It's a fast material to render. It doesn't have a lot of bells and whistles associated with it. And it allows us to create a very simple recreation of our environment, which is pretty cool. If we were compared to a Lambert, instantly, just by looking at the quality of our shader ball, what's the big difference that you can see almost immediately? Yeah, there's no specular highlight, right? A Lambert, and let's just change it back into our look dev environment. If you look at the attributes that are available to us here, what isn't available? What section is completely absent with the Lambert shader? The specular highlight section, right? So Lamberts are really great for matte objects. Objects that aren't asked to recreate some sort of reflection or the illusion of some sort of reflection of a light source inside of the scene itself, okay? I very rarely use Lambert materials these days. Because if you think about it, a blend or a Phong material can give us the illusion of a Lambert just by turning the eccentricity all the way down to 0. Right? You can turn off a specular highlight. So I very rarely use Lamberts, but people out there, they're there. Okay? Now let's do Phong. Phong is pretty cool. Okay? Phong gives us a lot of features that we're used to seeing in the blend. Okay? However, the math is a little bit differently, and if you think about it, behind the scenes, there's an entire library of computer code that's determining how all of this is being generated on the surface itself. The Phong is an okay one, but what's most accurate is Phong. Oops, I hit the wrong button. Phong E is a good one. Okay. Phong E is pretty great. Yeah, because now there's some extra mojo in here. Okay. Roughness, highlight size, whiteness, specular color, reflectivity, and reflected color. The Phong E, in every sense, represents the most kind of current interpretation of how light interacts with the surface. Believe it or not, and this is something that I always love to kind of highlight, there are a lot of computer scientists that are trying to recreate reality as best as they can, as accurately as they can. The algorithms and the foundations of what we're using here in Maya are continually being refined, and new shaders and new materials are being updated and released that reflect the current kind of state of the computer science behind the scenes. The Phong E is the latest and the greatest. It's pretty fantastic. Okay, there is a movement going on right now called PBR, photorealistic rendering, and the PBR movement kind of distills a lot of these channels into simple kind of user-directed or user-facing kind of channels. But behind the scenes, there's a lot going on. For example, the roughness is a great illustration of that. The roughness, if you look at what's happening here, the roughness is doing kind of what the eccentricity or the fall-off size on our blend was doing, but it's doing it a little bit more predictably. The math has changed ever so slightly. Highlight size is doing exactly what you think it's going to. So my suggestion to you, and let's dump this up to like 5. There we go. My suggestion to you is to use the Phong E materials. They're more controllable. The math and the science is a little bit more realistic. And you're going to start to see that what we simulate here is going to be very similar to how our objects are seen out there in the real world. Okay? It's pretty great. I like the Phong E. Very nice, smooth gradient. And believe it or not, it's amazing how much energy we spend just looking at that transition between the core of the specular highlight and its boundaries. Okay? Cool, huh? Cool, huh? Not all shaders are made equal. Blinn is a good starting point. Lambert, it's one that we really don't use too often anymore. And then Fong Yi, in every sense, kind of represents the latest math coming from our computer scientists out there that are allowing us to recreate our reality. Okay, I've been yakking for more than an hour. Let's just take a small little 5-minute break. We'll come back and we'll start talking about textures and how to get textures onto our objects. All right. So before the break, we spent some time talking about materials, and I just want to start talking about some ideas that are going to help you guys successfully recreate your lab assignment this week. Now, I've downloaded the project file that I gave you guys on Canvas under the marker scene assignment sheet, and here it is, just a simple little scene, some art markers, okay? And the big picture idea behind this project here is that naturally we go through and apply materials and textures to everything, okay? We want to start really asking the computer to draw this image a little bit more directly. Now, if you take another step back and return to Canvas and look at specifically what you're being asked to accomplish, look at the banner image for a second. That's what we're after, right? Now, what do you see in this image here? What do you see? How many materials do you see? Let's just put it that way. So each marker has 2 materials assigned to it, but one of those materials can be shared between all the markers, right? Which one can be shared between all the markers? The black, yeah. So we have one black material that we can assign to portions of the marker, and then there's a red, orange, a yellow, green, blue, and purple, okay? In addition, we also have that material for the ground as well, okay? This is what I want to spend some time talking about now, and that's how to import and include what's called a texture into our shading network, okay? A texture, and it's really easy to create and or apply a texture map to some geometry. However, this is usually where the intensity kind of gets ratcheted up a little bit, because we're now being faced and we're now basically being asked to work inside of a graph, into the core of what's called the hypershade, and that's the graph. Okay, let's take a look at it. It's pretty fun. Let's just jump back over into Maya real fast. And you know, whenever we start working inside of any scene file that's been given to us, the first thing that I do, almost just right off the bat, is just look at the outliner and get a really good understanding of how all these parts and pieces are put together. Okay. Now, by looking at my outliner, what can you see that's in here? Looking at the outliner exclusively. What do you see in the outliner? Yeah, we have one mesh object. One mesh object. So all, 6 of the markers and the ground plane that they're currently residing on are encapsulated by that single mesh object. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but perhaps we want to revisit this a little bit and start separating these mesh objects away from each other so that we can control them a little bit more directly, okay? Having everything in one mesh object is okay in certain areas, in certain moments, but really, we need to be control freaks. We want to start dividing out our scene into logical parts. Now, what would be the logical parts and pieces for our scene here? Okay, yeah. For me, the logical parts that we should divide out is each marker into its own mesh object, right? Each marker into its own group, and then the ground plane maybe in its own group. By separating things out, we can control them individually, and this is kind of neat, we can also toggle their visibility individually, which makes it a little bit easier to work with, especially when we're dealing with scenes that are quite large, and I mean massive large. On Thursday, we're going to spend a lot of time working on a scene that is quite big, okay? I'm going to keep it simple for today, but let's just take a look at the process of separating these things out into their own objects, okay? As one might imagine, it begins and ends with a selection, and I'm just going to do one so you guys can see what's going on. I want to change over into component mode, select some faces, and I've selected that ground plane, and I want to separate just that polygon. I want to put that polygon on its own independent, separate mesh object. Has anyone discovered how to do this? Yeah, go ahead. Separate, yeah. And most importantly, before we get too much further into it, we need to be in our modeling tab. So all the pull-down menus at the top of the screen reflect all of our modeling tool properties. That's a good one. Modeling tool operations and properties. And where we're going is this mesh pull-down menu. And right at the top, we have a couple options in here that we need to look at, a couple tools. We have Booleans, which we'll talk about in the future. Then we have combine and separate. And they're going to do exactly what you think they're going to do. They're either going to combine multiple mesh objects into one, or take a single mesh object and begin to split it, separate them out into their own discrete mesh objects. Let's just do it real fast. I'm going to choose separate. And now, if you look over here in our outliner, the hierarchy has changed ever so slightly. Let's hit the plus sign. We have polysurface 2 and polysurface 1. Okay? Selecting them shows us that polysurface 2 are all the polygons that constitute the markers. Then polysurface 1 is the ground itself. Okay? Now let's be good stewards of our scene here and just name this ground. There we go. And keep ourselves a little bit more organized. Okay? Let's do that one more time. I'll do it maybe on the first marker just to get things kind of going here. I'm going to change my selection state over into a component selection state, and then just start double-clicking on the parts and pieces of my marker. Then mesh, separate. Bloop. There it is. Okay. Now it actually broke it into its independent pieces. Okay, because there's actually 2 pieces in here. Okay. You can actually combine those into its own polysurface. Okay. Each one of these surfaces, if you really take a step back and look at it, these are the contiguous polygonal islands, right? Each marker, and let me just go back to this other one here real fast. So there's a polygonal island, basically like the tube of the marker is one solid piece, all welded together. And then we have the tip over here, which is its own polygonal island, okay? So when we separate them, it's actually separating out all the polygonal islands into their own individual pieces, okay? So just be aware of that, okay? Here's one marker. Here's the ground. I believe you can even take these out of the groups if you like. You don't necessarily have to keep them in the groups. I'm using my middle mouse button to the left, or to middle mouse button, drag them out of their hierarchies, just to give me a little bit more direct control. Hitting the return key or the enter key on your keyboard in the outliner, or by double-clicking on it, will allow you to change the name of it. Let's call this one marker 1. There we go. So the ground and marker 1. Now I'm just going to leave it at that. I'll let you guys continue to work with them on your own for your lab. So let's start applying some materials to these so that we can start shading them and describing them a little bit more directly. Now, the markers themselves, that's going to be pretty easy. What's new and different is that ground plane, right? Because we want to use maybe a texture, an image, a picture, if you will, to describe the details of our ground. The illusions that we create in the computer don't exclusively have to be created from the materials, those basic parameters, because as we saw, the materials are just going to change the illusion of how the light is interacting with the surface, right? That's all a material is doing. If we want to get a more photorealistic look, believe it or not, the fastest way to get there is to use pictures, okay? This is part of our process. It's not cheating. We're not like, doing a little around the back movement here to get to the end result. This is part of our core workflow. And luckily for us, Maya supports this workflow in a pretty direct fashion. As one might imagine, let's apply some materials first, and then we'll jump into the hypershade and start looking at how we can edit those materials. I'm going to grab my ground plane here. There we go. And let's assign a new material. And I want to use my good old Fong E here. There we go. Let's give it a good name before we go any further. Let's just give it a good name. I'm going to call it ground, or ground 1. Some people in their naming convention, they do this, which is fine. I've seen this a bazillion times. They'll do ground all in caps, and then a lowercase m to represent material. A lot of ways you can do this. Or I've also seen people do the opposite way. They'll put an M first, which represents material, and then ground. Many ways of establishing a naming convention that has a meaning. Okay, so here's my ground material. I can go in and naturally change the color. Anything I want. I can make it a lovely shade of red, which isn't what I want to do, though, right? I want to use a picture. I want to place a picture on that object, okay? And I want you to, in your mind, to underscore the word place, okay? Because that's ultimately what we're going to ask the computer to do. It's not going to create a picture. It's going to take an existing picture and place it on a polygon, okay? Next week, we're going to take a massive step forward in this idea, and we'll start looking at how we can place pictures on really complex objects. Today, we're just going to do a flat surface, baby steps, right? Let's check it out. Let's go back into our attribute editor here real fast. There's our material. And if you look very, very carefully on the color row, if you will, we have this thing, the little checkerboard, okay? This color, or this checkerboard, is going to allow us to add an input node for this material, okay? And check it out, it's already selected the input nodes that are associated or that can be connected to this color channel. And this is where we're going, right here. File. This list is overwhelming. I know, it is, okay? There's nothing I can do about that. But we're looking for the file input node. Think about it. We want to take a file, a JPEG, a PNG, a TIFF Targa, some image, and we're going to place it on top of our object, okay? So we hit File. Check it out. Now, some things have changed here, okay? And we've added a new node into our system. We have a File node, and then a Place 2D Texture node. Let's handle this individually, then we'll jump back over to this Place 2D Texture. The File node's responsibility inside of the graph that we're creating is to simply just load an image. That's all it's doing. We're pointing the computer to a very specific JPEG on our machine. So if we cruise down here, there it is, image. This little folder icon will allow you to load in an image. It's going to bring up the Maya Finder. And I just happen to have a texture, an image, a photograph. That's all this is. It's a photograph, okay? It's a photograph of some wooden planks, okay? If I hit open, it looks like nothing's happened, okay? However, if you hit the, 6 key on your number pad, we can start to see that image show up on the actual polygon itself, okay? There it is. There's the picture of my wooden planks just chilling on my object, okay? Let's do this one more time, or just let's review that sequence one more time. I'm going to hit the undo key, okay? Because it is a little strange, and it's quite lengthy, okay? So the first thing that we got to do is that we have to select the material that we want to change. In this case, it's called mground. The material that's responsible for shading this big gigantic polygon underneath my markers. And then where inside the attribute editor are we going to begin this process of importing and placing a texture on our polygon? Color, right? Color. In every sense, we're kind of overwriting the color channel, the color value that we picked with the color picker, and we're overwriting it with an image. So here's the color row. We don't want this color. We want an image. We click on the little checkerboard. Okay. This is going to allow us to create a file placement node. Long laundry list of things that we can add. It really is. But we want file. Okay. Then the attribute editor is going to update and change. The first thing that we see, the first input node that we have to edit is this file node. We have to tell it specifically which file to load. We'll click on the folder. We'll go find the image, and these images can be found basically anywhere. Okay. You can put them on your model. Okay. Now, if you don't see the image on your model, hit the number 6 key on the top row of your keyboard, and that will change your OpenGL viewport to display all the images that have been mapped to your materials. And like as one might imagine, these are images that are absolutely going to be rendered. Whoop, there it is. It's kind of blown out at the moment because I don't have any lights in my scenes, using the default global light, which is just kind of horrible. Okay. So what in the world is going on behind the scenes here? Let's see specifically what's happening and get a really good solid understanding of how we can work and continue to edit all these textures inside of our system. Now, entering into the Hypershade is really easy by going into the top of the screen, Windows, Rendering Editors, oops, Hypershade. That's cool too, right? But check it out. There's also another keyboard shortcut way over here. That right there allows us to open the Hypershade too. So we have two different ways of getting into the Hypershade. Click on the little shader ball. It'll open up the Hypershade. Okay, check it out. So here is mground. Okay, mground. That's the material that's fundamentally responsible for the ground. Okay? Let me show you something here. This is kind of neat. If you hold down your middle mouse button and drag mground down into the graph area below, we can start to get a much better understanding of how all this stuff is put together. The Hypershade is a nodal shading environment. Imagine each one of those input nodes as its own little packet of computer code. And we can intercept the signals that are sent from each one of these packets and rewire them and create some pretty stunning results. Check it out. That's clear graph. There we go. I always forget which one it is. Nope. Hold on 2 seconds. Why isn't it graphing it for me? Nope. That's all the input nodes. Why am I not seeing my graph? There we go. I didn't have it selected. That's why. Because I'm a dork and I didn't see that I didn't have my thing selected. Many apologies. So I was hitting the buttons and nothing was changing. I thought you had to have your material selected. Okay. And if you look carefully here, if you select this little jobber, see how the inside get this lovely green border. That's what I neglected to do. And then hitting this button here on the center is going to expose all the inputs and outputs that are influencing this material. Okay. All right. I want to make my real estate here a little bit, different so you guys can see this area a little bit more directly because it is kind of fun. Let's check it out. All right. So each one of these nodes is a different part of the network that's responsible for creating the ground itself. And if you look at the flow of information here, you can start to figure it out. Now, this is going to be a process of frustration. We're going to dive into this a little bit in this class, but I wanted just to kind of show you the back end of the shading system so that we can start to understand how the computer's putting all this stuff together, because it's not magic. It's not magic, okay? If you think about it, ultimately, what we're asking the computer to do is influence this color channel. This node right here is responsible for placing the texture on the model itself. This is its sole focus. In other applications, this is called the texture locator. And the texture locator is responsible for putting this image or putting an image on the polygon, right? That's its sole exclusive utility, is to do that. Well, what image are we going to put in there, right? Well, this image. This is the image that we want this element to place, okay? The flow of information goes here. So all the placement information is then passed into the image. We load the image here, and then the output color information from the image node is sent over into the color channel of the material itself. Okay? This is called a graph, a nodal graph. Each one of these nodes is a different part of the program, if you will. It's kind of weird. It's wacky, definitely, for sure. And you'll get more comfortable working inside of this graph as you gain more experience inside the Hypershade itself. On Thursday, we're going to expand upon this a little bit more so we can start placing textures and images on more complex shapes other than a square. The Place 2D Texture node is exclusively responsible for figuring out how and where this image is going to be placed on the polygon itself. Not what image, but how. By selecting it, we expose all the channels that are important to us. Okay, these will become a little bit more important as we go through, on Thursday as well. But these individual channels here are determining how it's going to be placed on the polygon. Okay, so for example, let's see. I'm not using a UV map at the moment, but let's just change the coverage. There it is over there. If I put this to 0.5, 0.5, I think it got a little bit bigger in here. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So these channels in here are going to affect how it's going to be placed. Okay. This next one is what is going to be placed. Okay. Yep. You can actually reload the texture, edit which texture is going to be loaded in here. You can change the color space. For example, you could do, let's see, Rec 709. Okay, that's going to, now if you look very carefully down here in the viewport, it's more contrasty. It's not as washed out. Okay, it's pretty cool. And then this is the material itself. So a flow of information. That's how I think of it. It's a river of information, and at each one of these stops, information is being passed to another node, it's being translated into something else, and then it ends up on the material, which then actually sends it to the surface shader, which is responsible for drawing, or one of the things that's responsible for drawing the shape. Pretty cool, huh? Pretty cool. Yeah, it gets, this rabbit hole goes very, very, very deep. Yes, ma'am? So how do I get all this info? Yeah. So if you're not seeing this, because this is just kind of a work area down here at the bottom, these little buttons up here, let's see, this one I think is clear. Doesn't delete the material, just kind of hides the visibility of all those nodes. Now if you want to see how your material is being created, with the middle mouse button, drag the material down here. Make sure you have it selected, and you know it's selected because you see that green boundary on the interior of the node. And then it's this middle, it's this middle button, that one, which will show you all the input and output connections associated with the material. It basically exposes the entire graph. Click on it, there it is. There's all your stuff. Cool, huh? Pretty cool. All right. So we have a little bit of time left in class today. I got about 45 minutes, and here's what I would like us to do in the remainder of our time today, is to go through and finish our lab assignment, okay? If you take a look at what we're striving to achieve here, I've given you this marker scene. It is your job to go in, add materials and textures to every single object inside the scene, find an image somewhere out there in the Google Imageverse, right, and map it to the ground plane or to anything. Have fun with it, right? And then to make a nice render. One thing that I want you guys to really focus on, this kind of dovetails into something we talked about last week, is that we need to change our render settings to be 1280 by 720. So go back into your notes, remember how to change the render settings. The default of 960 by 540 is not what we're looking for, okay? We want a final render size of 1280 by 720. I'll give you a massive, massive hint. It's somewhere in these buttons. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. The one with the gear. The one with the gear. So remember to go in and change your render settings to 1280 by 720 before you submit. Yes, ma'am. The Hypershade tool is acting up, okay? Okay, so this is something that I've seen people run into. This is actually a good thing for everyone to see. This is my hell. It really is, because in an open computer lab, people come in here all the time, and they just start poking on things, right? And they completely destroy our interface, and they break stuff all the time. And so you never know, and this is a great situation where you come in, and your Hypershade looks nothing like my Hypershade, right? So we need to rebuild it. Luckily, all these panels can be rebuilt. And let's just do, the property editor. Okay, so and this is a great example because it's just an easy one. So if I close out the property editor, that part of my interface is gone, right? How do I get it back? Good question. If you go to the top of the screen where it says Window, here are all the different parts of your window, right? Here's your bins, which is this thing over here, or this is the bins, I'm sorry. This is the Create tab. This is your viewport, I believe. But we want the property editor, so we'll bring that back open. But check it out. It's just floating here in its own window. Can I dock that somewhere? Yeah. It's kind of strange, and this is something that, oops, I just did it on accident, which isn't what I wanted to do. There it is down here. Sorry. Let's move it off again. This is something that it's not easily seen, but it is there. Check it out. I'm going to left-click and drag this over to this part of the interface. And once my cursor gets down to the bottom, you can see that the interface kind of changes a little bit. And then you let go. Whoops. Let's try that again. There it is. And now it's in there. Okay? So you can manually rebuild it just by dragging different parts of that around. So if I accidentally get rid of the material viewer, that's okay. So we just go to Windows, and then here it is, Material Viewer. And then I'm going to left-click and drag it above the property editor. Give it a second. Sometimes you have to find the spot that allows you to. There it is. We'll put it in down there. And let's see. Maybe now. Let's see if I can fix. Sometimes once it's in that frame, yeah, it'll allow you to pop it into another area. But you can rebuild it. You can rebuild it. Now, if you really don't want to rebuild it and you want to nuke all of your preferences and get it all back to the way the factory defaults should be, on the Mac it's a little bit different. But ultimately, where we need to go here is into our Mac OS system preferences, or global preferences, excuse me. So here's how to do it. It's really easy. Go to the top of the screen where it says Go. I'm in the Finder app, by the way. And if you hold down the Option key, you're going to expose the library folder. If you click on it, what we're looking for is a folder called Preferences, way down here at the bottom. And then we're also looking for a folder called Autodesk inside of that. And then follow it. There's Maya 2016. And then that's the folder. Just delete your entire Maya 2016 preferences prefs folder. Just delete it. Restart Maya. Everything will be returned back to its factory defaults. So let's do it one more time. So the Go menu in the Finder app. Hold down the Option key. It'll expose the library folder inside of the interface. Okay. Once you're in the library folder, you're looking for a subfolder called Preferences, and mine's listed alphabetically at the moment. Preferences, and then subsequently we're looking for Autodesk, Maya, 2016, and then Prefs. Here, let me see if I can cascade my view here so you can see where we're going. Yeah, just this entire folder, Maya Prefs, and then when you restart Maya, that Prefs folder will be recreated, and the application will be restored back to its factory defaults. Sound good? All right. So let's get to work. And I think this is probably a lab assignment you all can bang out today, and we'll come back in on Thursday and start talking about some more advanced material and shading properties that will give us some pretty stellar results. Okay? Let's get to work. I see your question. Give me 2 seconds. I'm just going to stop the live stream.